Welcome to part 7 of the Age of Progressive Reform. Now we're going to take a look at the fight for suffrage. One of the obstacles that women had to face in their plight for suffrage was overcoming the ideas of the women's traditional roles in America, right? And this is something that was becoming more and more challenged with the industrialization of America. You see, as more families moved into cities, the roles in men worked in factories, the roles of women began to change as well. You know, it used to be when America was largely rural, men and women worked together side by side, tending the fields, and now this was no longer the case. Women were working in factories as well. And a lot of the things that women used to produce at home, like clothing or preserving food, was now being made in factories. It was things that could simply be purchased. So the role of women in society was becoming confused. And there was actually an effort by preachers and politicians and newspapers and even some female writers to try and define the virtues of women in these changing times and these virtues that they must continue to possess, these traditional roles. And that was the idea of piety, that the woman is the source of spirituality in the home, and that she is needed to cultivate that trait so she can pass it to her children, and also temper their husbands, who are often exposed to the depravity of the modern world, that they are to remain pure, right, to maintain purity, that a woman should remain chaste until marriage, and then even after marriage should only approach sex as necessary for procreation, that they need to be submissive, that a woman must submit to the authority of men, and though she should be able to express her views, ultimately the husband has the final say. And then finally, the idea of domesticity, right? The woman is to devote herself to making the home clean and comfortable and peaceful for her husband, right? These are those traditional roles that are now being challenged by industrialization, right? Any change to the normal, though, is seen by a lot of these people that are trying to push this and maintain this are not to be tolerated, right? And so you see some examples where these roles get challenged, and there's some backlash. For example, in 1873, the woman you see here is Myra Bradwell. Myra had studied law with her husband. Her husband was studying to be an attorney, and to help him, she studied too. So when after he'd passed the bar, she thought, well, why not? I've done all the studying as well. I'll apply to pass the Illinois bar as well. Well, she was denied admission to take the bar exam because she was a woman. So what did she do? She sued. She said, I should have the right. I've done all the same studying. I've done all the same training. I should be able to do it. So she appealed this decision and went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But the U.S. Supreme Court is going to deny her appeal. And this is what they're going to say. They're going to say, it is true that many women are unmarried and not affected by the duties, complications, and incapacities arising out of the married state, but these are the exceptions to the general rule. The paramount destiny and mission of women are to fulfill the noble and benign office of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator, and the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things and cannot be based on exceptional cases. So see, even the Supreme Court is trying to fight to maintain these ideas of women's traditional roles in society. However, like I said, because of this urbanization, industrialization, these are just going to continually be further and further challenged. So in the 19th century, you're going to start seeing women reject some of these ideas around these traditional roles, right, and challenge this status quo. Right? For example, in 1840, there's going to be a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. There's going to be a lot of prominent anti-slavery speakers there, and 2 American delegates will arrive, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you see pictured here, and another abolitionist and suffragist by the name of Lucretia Mott. They're both going to show up to speak out against slavery at this convention. However, they will not be allowed to speak. Why? Well, because they're women. They're not going to be allowed to speak at this conference. Elizabeth Cady Stanton will later say that we resolve to hold a convention as soon as we return home and form a society of our own to advocate rights for women. And they will. In 1848, they are going to form they're going to hold a suffrage convention in Seneca Falls, right? The Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848 is going to issue what's known as the Declaration of Sentiments. It's modeled after the Declaration of Independence that spells out women's demands for equality. Now, they didn't copy the Declaration of Independence to, get a 0 on an assignment in my class for plagiarism. They did it because they knew the language would be something that people would recognize, right? And that's why it's modeled after that. So women are getting more and more involved in challenging the status quo. And it kind of makes sense when you take a look at the demographics that are developing, especially amongst middle class and upper class women, right? More women are getting college educations. For example, in 1870, the collegiate student body of the United States was about 21% female. By 1890, it was 36%, and by 1920, it was almost half, right? Nearly every woman making up the women's suffrage movement had some sort of college education. Also, women were entering the workforce in larger and larger numbers during the Gilded Age, not just amongst the working class people, but also the middle class, right? In 1870, only 13% of women worked outside of the home, but by 1900, that had risen to 20%, right? Middle class women were beginning to enter occupations that were once actually held primarily by men, including teacher, nurse, things like that, right? So initially, this didn't cause too much alarm by the traditionalists because they kind of thought, well, once the woman gets married, she'll willingly leave her job and go do her destined role as wife and mother. But as we see as we move forward, that is going to be challenged even further. By the late 19th century, these educated women began forming clubs to begin challenging the status quo and begin clamoring for reform, right? Now, most of these clubs tended to focus on education, right? There's book clubs, there were history clubs, and there were even art clubs, right? But other clubs formed to focus on social reforms and political reforms, right? Topics included things like urban beautification. Remember we talked about the playground movement, for example, public education, child labor, and of course that public motherhood in general that we also talked about, right? Prohibition was a major issue when it came to some of these clubs. A matter of fact, in 1874, you're going to have the formation of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. It was founded in Cleveland, Ohio, right? Annie Whitmire was elected the president, and Frances E. Willer, the secretary, and these two women formed the backbone behind that. Now you see the picture I use here to represent that is that woman in the bottom right-hand corner. That's Carrie Nation. She's a little bit more of the militant arm of this prohibition movement, who we can talk about later, right? But the formation of these and other groups are going to affect the way that women are involved in two ways. First of all, it gave women a forum to develop leadership skills and develop networks of activism that's going to be very important during the Progressive Era. And second, it drew women into the political spectrum. So before they even had suffrage, you start seeing women beginning to exercise a political vote or a political voice before they even have the physical vote. So while all this is going on, you also have the development of suffrage movements and suffrage organizations. For example, in May of 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are going to form the National Women's Suffrage Association. Now, Susan B. Anthony is also often seen as the picture of the suffrage movement, and she already has some experience in the suffrage movement prior to this formation of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Matter of fact, she had gotten arrested in 1868 when she had registered to vote in New York State and had voted for Ulysses S. Grant in the presidential election. Not only did she get arrested, but the men who registered to vote got arrested for it as well, right? Now, the National Women's Suffrage Association was calling for a national constitutional amendment to allow women's suffrage. And they were spurred on by the passage that year and ratification that year of a constitutional amendment called the 15th Amendment that gave minority men the vote. It went into effect January 1st of 1870. Well, if minority men were given the vote, why not women, right? Why not all women? Okay, so the result of this is that they will get a constitutional amendment introduced in Congress in 1878. A constitutional amendment that will later be known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment that allowed women's suffrage. Now, 1878, the 19th Amendment, or the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, will not be ratified until and go into effect until 1920. So for the next 42 years, this amendment is going to bounce around in committees in Congress before it finally gets ratified and put in the Constitution. Matter of fact, both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony will not live to see this actually become constitutional law. Now, also, there's a competing organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association. Whereas the National Women's Suffrage Association is focusing on suffrage at the federal level, the American Women's Suffrage Association is going to focus on suffrage on a state level, right? Remember, each state gets to decide who votes. It doesn't say in the Constitution who gets to vote, okay? So states can decide. So the AWSA was working to do that, and they're going to have a little bit more success here in the early stages than the National Women's Suffrage Association. For example, they'll manage to get Wyoming to allow women's suffrage in 1869 when it was still a territory, and when it became a state, that also it maintained women's suffrage. In Colorado, you're going to have suffrage adopted there. Western states are going to be the first ones to adopt women's suffrage, and there's really a reason for that. When you think about it, there's a lot fewer women in the West, and the populations in general are lower. When you had people migrating to the West, a lot of times it was just men trying to seek their fortune or seek land or whatever, not nuclear families. And so Mars doesn't need women. Montana needs women. What better way to attract them and say, hey, come out here west, we give you the vote, right? And so you're going to see a lot of Western states. Matter of fact, by the 1890s, several states had granted suffrage, pretty much all of them in the West. Okay. Now, in 1890, there is going to be the merging of these two organizations. The two will join together in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So now, collectively, they're going to work both on the local level and the national level, and then that would move us into the next generation of suffragists, and this next generation of suffragists are the ones that are going to finally see this through to completion.